The bitter winter wind howled across the Colorado plains, carrying with it the sting of ice and the promise of death for any soul caught unprepared. Willow Kincaid's fingers had long since lost feeling as she urged her exhausted mare forward through the blinding curtain of snow that had appeared seemingly from nowhere, transforming what should have been a straightforward journey to La Junta into a desperate fight for survival. It was February 1878, and Willow had been traveling for 3 days from Denver, where she'd buried her father after his long illness. At 22, she was now alone in the world, heading to La Junta to take over her late uncle's newspaper, an inheritance that had come as a surprise, but offered the fresh start she desperately needed. Now, as the temperature plummeted and daylight faded, that fresh start seemed increasingly unlikely. "Come on, Maple," she urged her horse, leaning forward against the punishing wind. "Just a little farther." But even as she spoke the words, Willow knew they were empty encouragement. The landmarks she'd been following had disappeared in the whiteout conditions, and the trail had vanished beneath a growing blanket of snow. Her map, carefully tucked inside her coat, was useless without visible reference points. Each breath burned her lungs, and the cold had settled so deeply into her bones that the thought of simply closing her eyes and surrendering to it grew more tempting by the minute. Maple stumbled, nearly sending Willow tumbling into the snow. The mare had been struggling for the past hour, her head hanging low, steam puffing from her nostrils in labored clouds. Willow knew she couldn't ask much more of her faithful companion. "I'm sorry, girl," she whispered, dismounting with legs so numb she nearly collapsed. "We need to find shelter." But shelter was nowhere to be found on the open plains. No trees, no rock formations, nothing but endless white in every direction. Willow fought back tears that would only freeze on her cheeks. She began to lead Maple forward, hoping against hope that they might stumble upon some kind of refuge. Time lost meaning as they trudged through the deepening snow. Willow's thoughts grew hazy, and she found herself thinking of her childhood home in Boston, of her father's laugh, of the warmth of summer days that seemed impossibly distant now. When she stumbled for the 3rd time in as many minutes, she knew she couldn't go much further. The crack of a rifle shot cut through the howl of the wind, so unexpected that at first Willow thought she'd imagined it. She stopped, straining to hear over the storm. Another shot, closer this time. "Hello," she called, her voice weak and immediately swallowed by the wind. "Please, help." Through the curtain of white, a dark shape materialized, a horse and rider, moving with purpose despite the blizzard. As they drew nearer, Willow could make out a tall figure bundled against the cold, rifle in hand. "Miss," a deep voice called, "you're a long way from anywhere in this storm." Willow had never been so grateful to hear another human voice. "We're lost," she managed through chattering teeth. "My horse. She can't go much farther." The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing himself to be a man of considerable height. He approached carefully, as though afraid he might startle her. When he stood before her, Willow could see his face partially obscured by a scarf, keen blue eyes set in a weathered face, snow clinging to his eyebrows and the brim of his hat. "Preston Blackwell," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Most folks call me Prees." His eyes narrowed as he took in her condition. "You're half frozen, miss. How long have you been out in this?" "Hours," Willow admitted. "I thought I could make it to La Junta before the storm hit." Preston shook his head. "La Junta's still a good 15 miles south." "You'd never have made it, especially not in this." He glanced at the darkening sky. "We need to get you somewhere warm and fast. My cabin's about 2 miles east of here." "Can you ride?" Willow nodded, though she wasn't entirely certain she could stay mounted. "Your mare's done in," Preston observed, running a gloved hand along Maple's neck. "She'll have to follow. You'll ride with me." Before Willow could protest, Preston had secured her bags to Maple's saddle and was helping her mount his own horse, a sturdy buckskin that seemed remarkably unfazed by the blizzard. He swung up behind her, his arm coming around her waist to hold her steady as he took the reins. "Lean back against me," he instructed, his breath warm against her ear, "and hold onto the saddle horn if you can." Willow did as she was told, too cold and exhausted to feel any impropriety in the closeness. Preston clicked his tongue, and the buckskin began moving forward, Maple following behind on a lead rope. The solid warmth of the man behind her was the only thing keeping Willow from slipping into unconsciousness. "Stay awake, miss," Preston said sharply when her head lolled back against his shoulder. "What's your name?" "Willow," she managed. "Willow Kincaid." "Well, Miss Kincaid, I need you to keep talking. Tell me what brings you to these parts." Through numb lips, Willow explained about her father's death and the newspaper she was to inherit. Preston listened, occasionally prompting her with questions when her voice began to fade, keeping her engaged and awake despite the cold that seemed determined to claim her. It felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 30 minutes, before a dark shape loomed through the snow, a small cabin nestled against a rise in the land that offered some protection from the wind. "Home sweet home," Preston announced, dismounting and reaching up to help Willow down. Her legs buckled the moment they touched the ground, and he caught her easily, lifting her into his arms. "I've got you." Willow was beyond embarrassment as Preston carried her to the cabin door, somehow managing to open it while still holding her. Inside was dark and cold, but blessedly free from the biting wind. He set her down carefully on a chair before moving quickly around the cabin, lighting a lantern, then kneeling at the fireplace. "Need to get a fire going," he said, his movements efficient as he arranged kindling and logs. "Then I'll see to the horses." Willow watched through half-lidded eyes as Preston coaxed a small flame to life, nurturing it until it caught the larger logs. Only when the fire was crackling steadily did he stand, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders before heading back outside to tend to the animals. Left alone, Willow tried to take in her surroundings. The cabin was small but well-built and tidy. A bed stood against one wall, a table with 2 chairs in the center, and a small stove in the corner. Shelves held books, supplies, and cooking implements. It was simple but comfortable, the home of a man who valued function over ornament. Preston returned, bringing with him a blast of cold air and a flurry of snow. He stomped his boots and removed his heavy coat, hanging it by the door. "Horses are settled in the lean-to," he reported, moving to the stove. "It's not much, but it'll keep them out of the worst of it. Now, let's get you warmed up properly." He filled a kettle with water from a bucket and set it on the stove to heat, then turned his attention to Willow. In the light of the fire and lantern, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with strong features and those striking blue eyes. His dark hair was overlong, curling slightly at the nape of his neck, and a few days' worth of stubble darkened his jaw. "We need to get you out of those wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly. "I'll turn my back, but you need to change. Frostbite's nothing to trifle with." He rummaged in a trunk and produced a flannel shirt and a pair of wool trousers that would swallow her whole. "These will be too big, but they're dry and warm." Willow hesitated, but the painful tingling that had started in her extremities as they began to thaw convinced her of the necessity. Preston turned his back, busying himself with the kettle as she struggled out of her frozen garments. Her fingers were clumsy, and every movement sent fresh waves of painful prickling through her limbs, but eventually she managed to change into the offered clothing. "I'm decent," she said softly. Preston turned and nodded approvingly. "Better. Now let's have a look at those hands and feet." He knelt before her, taking her hands in his and examining them carefully. His touch was gentle but clinical as he checked her fingers, then motioned for her to extend her feet. Willow's cheeks burned despite the cold as he removed her boots and sodden stockings. "You're lucky," he pronounced. "No serious frostbite, though you'll be uncomfortable for a while as you warm up. Drink this." He handed her a tin mug of hot tea into which he'd stirred a generous spoonful of honey. "It'll warm you from the inside." Willow accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping her painful fingers around the warm mug. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." "Please," he corrected, "and let's not dwell on what might have been." He moved to the stove, ladling something from a pot into a bowl. "Venison stew. It's been simmering all day, and you need hot food." As Willow ate the hearty stew and sipped the sweet tea, feeling gradually returned to her limbs in waves of tingling discomfort. Preston sat across from her, drinking his own tea and watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "What were you doing out in the storm?" she asked eventually. "Hunting, checking my trap lines," he replied. "I was heading back when I spotted movement that didn't belong. Lucky for both of us that I did." The fire popped and crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but in here, Willow was safe, warm, and for the first time since her father's death, not completely alone. "The storm's not letting up any time soon," Preston said, moving to add another log to the fire. "You'll have to stay here tonight, maybe longer." "I've imposed enough already. It's not an imposition, it's survival," he cut her off. "Nobody travels in weather like this." "Not if they want to live to tell about it." Willow couldn't argue with his logic. "Thank you," she said instead. "Truly." Preston nodded once, accepting her gratitude without comment. "You should rest. Take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," he said firmly, but not unkindly. "You've been through an ordeal, Miss Kincaid. Sleep will do you good." Too exhausted to argue further, Willow allowed herself to be guided to the narrow bed. Preston added another blanket over her, then returned to his place by the fire. The last thing Willow saw before sleep claimed her was his profile silhouetted against the flames. Strong and steady as he kept watch over her, Willow woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement. For a moment, she was disoriented, uncertain where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back: the blizzard, the near-death experience, the taciturn cowboy who had saved her life. She sat up slowly, her body aching in places she hadn't known could ache. The cabin was warm, the fire still burning steadily in the hearth. Outside, the wind still howled, perhaps even more fiercely than the night before. Preston stood at the stove, his back to her as he tended to something in a skillet. He'd clearly been up for some time. His hair was damp as though he'd washed, and he wore a fresh shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal corded forearms. "Good morning," Willow said, her voice rough from sleep. Preston turned, nodding to her. "Morning. How are you feeling?" "Sore, but alive." "Thanks to you," he shrugged off her gratitude. "Hungry, starving," she admitted. "Good, means you're recovering." He transferred eggs and bacon from the skillet to a plate and placed it on the table. "Coffee, please." Willow rose from the bed, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles, and made her way to the table. She was acutely aware of her appearance, hair tousled from sleep, wearing this man's oversized clothing, face likely pale and drawn from her ordeal. Yet Preston didn't seem to notice or care about such things. He placed a steaming mug of coffee before her and sat across the table with his own plate. "Storm's gotten worse," he said without preamble. You won't be traveling today or likely tomorrow either. Willow's heart sank. But I need to get to La Junta. I'm already late, and I don't want them to give the newspaper to someone else. Preston raised an eyebrow. No one's going anywhere in this, Miss Kincaid. La Junta will still be there when the weather clears. Please call me Willow, she said, sighing as she looked toward the window, which showed nothing but swirling white. And I suppose you're right. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Willow's curiosity got the better of her. You live here alone, Mr. Blackwell. Please, he reminded her. And yes, no family. A shadow crossed his face. Not anymore. Willow immediately regretted her question. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry. Preston shook his head. It's a fair question. My wife died 5 years ago. Fever took her and our infant son. The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, struck Willow to the core. That's terrible. I'm so sorry for your loss. Life out here can be harsh, he said, his voice matter of fact. You adapt or you don't survive. He took a sip of coffee. What about you? Anyone waiting for you in La Junta besides that newspaper? No, Willow replied. My father was my only family after my mother passed when I was 12. He raised me alone in Boston, taught me everything I know about journalism. When he died last month, there was nothing keeping me there. Then I received the letter about Uncle Edward's newspaper. Edward Kincaid, Preston nodded in recognition. Good man. Ran the La Junta Chronicle, didn't he? Yes, Willow was surprised. Did you know him? Met him a few times when I went to town. He wasn't afraid to print the truth, even when it wasn't popular. People respected that. Preston studied her over his coffee cup. You planning to run the paper yourself? That's the idea, Willow confirmed. I grew up in my father's newspaper office. I can set type, write articles, even handle the business side. It's in my blood. Preston seemed to consider this. La Junta's not Boston, he said finally. People here might not take kindly to a woman running the newspaper. Willow lifted her chin. Then they'll have to get used to it. For the first time, Preston's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. I believe they will. After breakfast, Willow insisted on helping with the dishes, though her hands were still tender from their near frostbite. Preston didn't argue, simply handed her a towel while he washed. They worked side by side in silence, and Willow found herself surprisingly comfortable in his presence, despite having known him less than a day. I should check on the horses, Preston said when they'd finished. He pulled on his heavy coat and wrapped a scarf around the lower half of his face. Keep the fire going while I'm gone. Willow nodded, watching as he braced himself and stepped out into the storm, closing the door firmly behind him. Alone in the cabin, she took the opportunity to explore a little more. The bookshelves held an eclectic collection, practical manuals on animal husbandry and wilderness survival alongside volumes of poetry, history, and philosophy. Not what she'd expected from a solitary cowboy. Her eyes were drawn to a small frame on one of the shelves, containing a daguerreotype of a young woman with a gentle smile. Next to it sat a carved wooden horse, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. Willow reached for it, then stopped herself. These were private things, reminders of the family Preston had lost. Instead, she moved to the window, rubbing a small circle in the frost to peer outside. The snow fell so thickly she could barely see 10 feet from the cabin. A flicker of movement caught her eye Preston, emerging from what must be the lean to where the horses were sheltered. He moved with confidence despite the blinding conditions, a man entirely at home in this harsh environment. Willow stepped away from the window when he turned toward the cabin, not wanting to be caught watching him. She busied herself adding another log to the fire just as the door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and a snow-covered Preston. Horses are fine, he reported, stomping snow from his boots and hanging his coat by the door. "Your mare's recovered well. Strong animal." "Maple was my father's," Willow said. "He bought her as a colt, trained her himself, said she was stubborn like me." She smiled at the memory. Preston nodded, seeming to understand the value of such a connection. Good horse is worth their weight in gold out here. He moved to the stove, where a pot of coffee still sat warming, and poured himself a fresh cup. "Going to be a long day cooped up in here," he said. "Might as well make the best of it." The day passed more quickly than Willow would have expected. Preston proved to be surprisingly knowledgeable on a wide range of subjects, and though not talkative by nature, he answered her questions thoughtfully when she asked about his life in Colorado. She learned he'd come west after the war, having served with the Union Army despite being born in Virginia. He tried his hand at various occupations: cowboy, hunter, guide, before settling on this parcel of land 3 years ago. "Not much, but it's mine," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Raise a few cattle, hunt, trap. Do some work for the larger ranches when they need extra hands." "It must get lonely," Willow observed, then immediately wished she could take back the words. It wasn't her place to comment on his solitary existence, but Preston didn't seem offended. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but there's a piece to it that suits me." He looked at her curiously. "What about you? Won't you miss the society of a city like Boston?" Willow considered the question. "I'll miss certain aspects: the libraries, the theaters, the bookshops. But after Father died, the city felt empty somehow, like I was surrounded by people but completely alone." She traced a finger along the grain of the wooden table. "I think I'm ready for something different." Preston nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Fresh start." "Exactly." As evening approached, Preston prepared a simple but filling supper of beans, salt pork, and corn bread. Willow insisted on helping, and they worked together in the small space, moving around each other with a growing ease that surprised her. Over dinner, Preston asked about her plans for the newspaper, listening attentively as she outlined her ideas for expanding coverage and perhaps adding illustrations. "You're ambitious," he observed, but there was no criticism in his tone. "Life's too short not to be," Willow replied. "My father always said a good newspaper should inform, challenge, and occasionally comfort its readers. I intend to do all three." "Edward would approve," Preston said. "La Junta could use a fresh perspective." After they'd cleaned up from supper, Preston retrieved a battered checkerboard from a shelf. "Care for a game?" he asked. "Might help pass the evening." They set up at the table, the fire crackling cheerfully in the hearth as the wind continued its assault on the cabin walls. Preston proved to be a shrewd opponent, but Willow had learned from her father, who'd been a county champion back in Massachusetts. "You're good," Preston conceded after she'd won their second game. "Been a while since anyone's beaten me twice in a row." "My father taught me," Willow said, setting up the board for another round. "He said games of strategy were excellent training for a journalist, teaches you to look several moves ahead." Smart man, he was. Willow felt the familiar pang of grief, but it was tempered now by fond remembrance. "What about you? Who taught you to play?" "My grandfather," Preston replied, making his first move. He had little patience for foolishness, but he'd sit for hours playing checkers or chess. As they played, Willow found herself studying Preston's face in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting against the sun, the thoughtful furrow of his brow as he contemplated his next move. He wasn't classically handsome, but there was a quiet strength to his features that she found compelling. Catching herself staring, Willow quickly looked back at the board. What was she thinking? This man was a stranger, her rescuer by chance, nothing more. In a few days, when the storm passed, She would continue to La Junta and likely never see him again. The thought brought an unexpected pang of regret. "Your move," Preston prompted, and Willow realized she'd been lost in thought. They played late into the evening, the howling of the wind outside making their shelter seem all the more cozy by contrast. When Willow failed to stifle a yawn, Preston immediately began packing away the checkers. "You should rest," he said. "Take the bed again." "I can't put you out of your bed a second night," Willow protested. "The floor by the fire will be fine for me." Preston's expression made it clear he found the suggestion preposterous. "You're still recovering from nearly freezing to death and you're my guest. Take the bed." His tone brooked no argument, and Willow was too tired to insist. "Thank you," she said simply, retreating to the narrow bed. Preston banked the fire for the night and spread his bedroll on the floor nearby. Willow watched as he stretched out, using his saddle as a pillow, seemingly unbothered by the hard floor. "Good night, please," she said softly. "Good night, Willow," he replied, his deep voice the last thing she heard before drifting into sleep. The next day brought no change in the weather. If anything, the storm seemed to have intensified overnight, the wind screaming around the eaves of the cabin like a living thing. Willow stood at the window after breakfast, peering out at the white wasteland. "Never seen a blizzard like this," she murmured. "How long can it last?" Preston came to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Hard to say. Could break by nightfall, could go on another day or two. Nature follows its own timetable out here." Willow sighed, frustrated by the delay but aware there was nothing to be done about it. "What do you usually do when you're snowbound?" Preston considered the question. "Mend, tack, carve, read, catch up on things that get neglected when the weather's fair." He glanced at her. "Not much for entertainment, I'm afraid." "I don't need to be entertained," Willow assured him. "But I'd like to be useful. Is there something I could help with?" Preston seemed surprised by the offer, but after a moment's thought, he nodded. "Could use an extra pair of hands repairing some harness leather if you're willing." "Show me what to do," Willow said, grateful for the chance to focus on something other than the storm and her delayed plans. They spent the morning working side by side at the table, Preston patiently demonstrating how to punch holes in the leather and make the proper stitches to ensure the repairs would hold. Willow was a quick study, and soon they were working in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional instruction or question. "You're good at this," Preston observed as she finished a particularly tricky repair. "Steady hands." "Setting type for the newspaper requires a similar precision," Willow explained, "though I've never worked with leather before." "Useful skill out here," Preston said. "Things break and the nearest store might be days away." "Is that why you live so far from town?" Willow asked. "You seem entirely self-sufficient." Preston's hands stilled for a moment. "After Sarah, my wife, died, I couldn't stand the pity in people's eyes, or the well-meaning suggestions that I should find another good woman as if she were replaceable." His jaw tightened. "Easier to be on my own." Willow nodded, understanding all too well the pain of well-intentioned but misguided sympathy. "After my mother died, people would tell me at least I still had my father, as though that somehow balanced the scales, as though grief were a mathematical equation." "Exactly," Preston said, meeting her eyes. In that moment, Willow felt a connection between them, a shared understanding of loss that went beyond words. The moment was broken when Preston stood, stretching his back. "Should check on the animals again," he said, reaching for his coat. While he was gone, Willow continued working on the leather repairs, finding an unexpected satisfaction in the practical task. By the time Preston returned, stamping snow from his boots and bringing a blast of cold air with him, she had completed most of the remaining work. "Storm's starting to ease up a bit," he reported, hanging his coat by the door. "Still coming down, but the wind's not as fierce. Might clear by tomorrow." Willow felt a curious mix of relief and disappointment at the news. "That's good," she said, focusing on the harness in her hands. "I should be able to reach La Junta before they give up on me entirely." Preston nodded, moving to the stove to warm his hands. "I'll ride with you when the time comes. Make sure you get there safely." "You don't have to do that," Willow protested. "You've already done more than enough." "It's no hardship," he said simply. "Besides, I need supplies from town anyway." Willow recognized the explanation for what it was a way for him to offer help without making her feel further indebted. She appreciated the gesture more than she could express. The afternoon passed quietly, with Preston showing Willow some basic wood carving techniques after they'd finished with the leather repairs. His large, capable hands were surprisingly deft with the small knife, coaxing shape and form from a simple piece of pine. "What are you making?" Willow asked, watching as something began to emerge from the wood. "Horse," Preston replied. "Nothing fancy, just something to keep the hands busy." But as the carving progressed, Willow could see it was more than just a way to pass time. The small horse taking shape under his knife was beautifully detailed, with a flowing mane and a sense of movement that seemed impossible to capture in wood. "It's lovely," she said when he'd finished, holding the small figure in her palm. "You have a gift." Preston shrugged, but she could tell he was pleased by the compliment. "Like I said, helps pass the time." "Is that how you made the one on your shelf?" Willow asked, then immediately regretted the question when she saw his expression close off. "Yes," he said after a moment. "Made it for my son before he was born. Never got the chance to give it to him." "I'm sorry," Willow said softly. "I shouldn't have mentioned it." Preston shook his head. "It's all right, been 5 years. The memories don't cut quite so deep anymore." They prepared supper together, a stew made with dried beef and vegetables from Preston's carefully preserved stores. As they ate, the wind outside began to die down, just as Preston had predicted. "Sounds like it's finally letting up," Willow observed. Preston nodded. "If the snow stops overnight, we should be able to travel tomorrow. Ground will still be treacherous, but passable if we're careful." "I appreciate your offer to accompany me," Willow said, "but I don't want to take you away from your work here." "Cabin will still be standing when I get back," Preston said with a hint of a smile. "Besides, after a storm like this, I usually check on a few of the more isolated homesteads in the area, make sure everyone weathered it all right. That's very neighborly of you." "Out here, we look after each other," Preston said. "It's not charity, it's survival." After supper, they played another round of checkers, but Willow found it harder to concentrate than the previous evening. The prospect of leaving tomorrow filled her with a strange anxiety. She'd known this man barely 2 days, yet the thought of saying goodbye left her unsettled. When they finally retired for the night, Preston once again insisting she take the bed, Willow lay awake long after her host had fallen asleep. In the dim light of the banked fire, she could make out his profile as he slept, one arm thrown above his head, his breathing deep and even. Tomorrow she would reach La Junta and begin her new life as a newspaper editor. It was everything she'd been working toward since receiving word of her uncle's bequest. So why did the thought now fill her with such uncertainty? Morning brought clear skies and brilliant sunshine that turned the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling expanse of white. Willow stood in the doorway of the cabin, breathing in the crisp, clean air, marveling at the transformation. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Preston said, coming to stand beside her. "First light after a storm, everything fresh and new." "It's like the world has been reborn," Willow agreed. In Boston, snow turned dirty within hours. This is magical. They ate a hearty breakfast, then set about preparing for the journey to La Junta. Willow changed back into her own clothes, now thoroughly dried, while Preston packed provisions and checked the horse's tack one final time. "Ready?" he asked when everything was secured. Willow nodded, though in truth, she felt anything but ready. These few days in the isolated cabin had affected her in ways she couldn't fully articulate, even to herself. They set out under the brilliant blue sky, the horses struggling somewhat in the deep snow but making steady progress. Preston led the way, occasionally pointing out landmarks that had been invisible during the storm. Willow rode Maple, who seemed fully recovered from her ordeal and eager to be moving again. "That ridge there marks the halfway point to La Junta," Preston explained, gesturing toward a distant line of hills. "Once we pass it, the terrain levels out all the way to town." They rode in comfortable silence for much of the morning, the only sounds the creak of leather and the soft huffing of the horses as they made their way through the snow. Occasionally, Preston would point out animal tracks or share a bit of information about the area, but for the most part, they simply enjoyed the peaceful beauty of the winter landscape. Around midday, they stopped in a small grove of cottonwood trees to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of jerky, hard bread, and dried apples. Sitting on a fallen log that Preston had cleared of snow, Willow found herself studying her companion's profile as he surveyed the land around them. "Something on your mind?" he asked, catching her gaze. Willow blushed, embarrassed at being caught staring. "I was just thinking how different this is from what I expected when I decided to come west." "Oh," Preston raised an eyebrow. "And what did you expect?" "I'm not entirely sure," Willow admitted. "Adventure, I suppose, independence, a chance to prove myself." She brushed snow from her skirt. Nearly freezing to death wasn't part of the plan. Preston's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Plans have a way of changing out here. Nature has its own ideas." "Yes, I'm learning that," Willow said. "In Boston, everything was ordered, predictable. Here, it feels like anything could happen." "That's both the beauty and the danger of this country," Preston agreed. "You never know what each day will bring." They continued their journey after the brief rest, the horses moving more easily now as they followed a trail that gradually became more defined. By mid-afternoon, Willow could see smoke from distant chimneys on the horizon, the first sign of La Junta. "There it is," Preston said, pointing. "We should reach town before sundown." Willow felt a curious mix of excitement and reluctance as the town grew closer. This was what she'd traveled all this way for, the fresh start she'd been seeking. Yet she couldn't help glancing at the man riding beside her, wondering if their paths would ever cross again after today. As though reading her thoughts, Preston spoke. "The Chronicle office is on the main street near the general store. Your uncle lived in rooms above it." "Simple but comfortable enough." "You've been there," Preston nodded. "Placed a few advertisements over the years. Edward ran a good paper, fair and honest. People respected that." "I hope I can live up to his example," Willow said, suddenly nervous about the task ahead of her. "You will," Preston said with a certainty that bolstered her confidence. They rode into La Junta as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The town was smaller than Willow had imagined, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, most no more than 2 stories tall. People moved about their business, many stopping to stare at the newcomers with undisguised curiosity. "Strangers are noticed here," Preston explained when Willow commented on the attention. "Everyone knows everyone's business." "Wonderful," Willow murmured, straightening her spine. "Nothing like being the subject of town gossip before I've even properly arrived." Preston led her to a 2-story building with a weathered sign proclaiming it the La Junta Chronicle. The ground floor windows revealed a printing press and several desks. A separate entrance at the side presumably led to the living quarters above. "This is it," Preston said, dismounting and coming around to help Willow down from Maple. "Your new home." Willow accepted his assistance, acutely aware of his hands at her waist, the momentary closeness as her feet touched the ground. "Thank you," she said, stepping back, "for everything." Before Preston could respond, the door to the newspaper office opened, and a middle-aged man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers emerged, peering at them with frank curiosity. "Mr. Blackwell," he said, recognition dawning. "Didn't expect to see you in town so soon after that blizzard." His gaze shifted to Willow. "And who might this be, Thomas?" Preston nodded in greeting. "This is Miss Willow Kincaid, Edward's niece." The man's eyes widened. "Miss Kincaid, we'd given up hope of seeing you after that storm hit. Walter Jenkins was all set to take over the paper if you didn't show by week's end. I would have frozen to death in that blizzard if not for Mr. Blackwell," Willow said. "He found me lost on the plains and sheltered me until the storm passed." Thomas looked between them with new interest. "Did he now? Well, that's mighty fortunate." He stepped forward, extending his hand. "Thomas Erickson, Miss Kincaid. I was your uncle's typesetter and assistant. Been keeping things running since he passed. God rest his soul." Willow shook his hand, relieved to find a friendly face. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Erickson. I'm grateful you've kept the paper going in my absence. Call me Thomas, please, and it's been my honor. Edward was a good man and a better friend." He gestured toward the building. "Would you like to see the place? I've kept your uncle's rooms ready for your arrival." "Yes, thank you," Willow said, then turned to Preston, who had remained silent during the exchange. "Will you join us? I'd be glad to offer you coffee at least before you head back." For a moment she thought he might refuse, but then he nodded. Coffee would be welcome. Thomas led them inside, showing Willow around the newspaper office with evident pride. The space was smaller than her father's operation in Boston, but well organized and clean. The printing press was an older model but appeared well maintained, and the type cabinets were meticulously arranged. "Your uncle was particular about his equipment," Thomas explained. "Said a clean press makes clean copy, and clean copy makes for clear thinking." "My father said the same thing," Willow smiled, running her fingers lightly over the press. "This feels familiar, at least." They climbed the narrow stairs to the living quarters, which consisted of a small sitting room, a bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a modest bathroom with a copper tub. The furnishings were simple but of good quality, and the rooms were filled with natural light from large windows. "It's perfect," Willow declared, turning a complete circle in the sitting room. "Exactly what I need." Thomas beamed. "Edward would be pleased to hear you say so. Now, let me put that coffee on. You must both be exhausted after your journey." As Thomas busied himself in the kitchen, Willow moved to the window, looking out at the main street of what was now her home. Preston stood slightly apart, examining a bookshelf filled with bound volumes of past editions of the Chronicle. "Your uncle kept a record of every issue he published," he observed. 20 years of La Junta's history, right here." "A treasure trove for a journalist," Willow agreed, coming to stand beside him. "I can't wait to read through them." Their eyes met, and Willow felt a flutter of something undefined in her chest. There were things she wanted to say, questions she wanted to ask, but before she could find the words, Thomas returned with a tray of coffee cups. The three of them sat in the small sitting room, Thomas eagerly filling Willow in on the current state of the newspaper's business and the major stories they were following. Preston remained mostly silent, sipping his coffee and occasionally glancing out the window at the lengthening shadows. I should be heading back, he said finally, setting down his empty cup. Want to cover some distance before dark. Of course, Willow said, trying to mask her disappointment. I understand. Thomas looked between them, a knowing expression crossing his face. Actually, Mr. Blackwell, there's a storm front moving in from the west. Marshal Dawson was just telling me about it before you arrived. Might not be wise to start for home this late in the day. Preston frowned. Another storm. Not as bad as the last one, from what I hear, but enough to make travel difficult, especially after nightfall, Thomas said. The Simmons Hotel has rooms available, I'm sure. Willow found herself holding her breath as Preston considered this information. Part of her knew Thomas might be exaggerating the weather threat. She'd caught his speculative glance, but she couldn't bring herself to contradict him. Perhaps that would be prudent, Preston said finally. I'll stable the horses and see about a room. Excellent, Thomas said, standing. I should be getting home myself. My wife will be wondering what's keeping me. He turned to Willow. Unless you need anything else, Miss Kincaid. No, thank you, Thomas. You've been most helpful. I'll see you in the morning and we can discuss the next edition. After Thomas had departed, a slightly awkward silence fell between Willow and Preston. They were alone for the first time since arriving in town, and somehow the familiar ease they'd developed in the cabin seemed harder to recapture here. I should see to the horses, Preston said, moving toward the door. Of course, Willow nodded. And thank you again for everything. Preston paused, his hand on the doorknob. No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same. We both know that's not true, Willow said softly. Their eyes met again, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that had formed during their brief time together, tenuous but undeniably real. Good night, Willow, Preston said finally. I'll stop by in the morning before I head out. Good night, please, she replied, watching as he descended the stairs and disappeared from view. Alone in her new home, Willow moved slowly through the rooms, touching the furniture, examining the books and papers her uncle had left behind. This was what she had come west for, a fresh start, independence, a chance to build something of her own. It was everything she had wanted, so why did it suddenly feel incomplete? The next morning dawned clear and cold, with no sign of the storm Thomas had predicted. Willow couldn't decide whether to be amused or exasperated by the obvious matchmaking attempt. She rose early, eager to begin familiarizing herself with the newspaper's operations and to meet the citizens of La Junta, who would soon be her readers. She had just finished dressing when a knock came at the street door. Her heart quickened as she hurried down the stairs, knowing without being told who it would be. Preston stood on the threshold, hat in hand, looking unexpectedly formal in a clean shirt and jacket. His horse was saddled and waiting at the hitching post behind him, loaded with supplies. Good morning, Willow said, stepping back to invite him in. Would you like some coffee before you go? Thank you, Preston nodded, entering but remaining near the door as though uncertain of his welcome now that they were back in civilization. Willow led him to the small kitchen, where she'd already prepared coffee. They sat at the tiny table, the domestic scene a stark contrast to their first meeting in the midst of a blizzard just days before. Thomas was right about the hotel, Preston said after a moment. Clean rooms, decent food. I'm glad to hear it, Willow replied, wondering why they were suddenly reduced to talking about accommodations. There was so much more she wanted to say. I've picked up the supplies I needed, Preston continued. Should be able to make it home well before dark. That's good, Willow murmured. I imagine you're eager to get back. Preston studied his coffee cup, then looked up to meet her gaze directly. Actually, I wanted to ask if you would permit me to call on you again when I'm next in town. The request, so formal and unexpected, caught Willow off guard. "Yes, of course," she stammered. "I would like that very much." A hint of a smile touched Preston's lips. "Good, that's good." He hesitated, then added, "I'm not much for social calls or fancy talk, but I've enjoyed your company these past days." It was perhaps the most personal statement he'd made since they'd met, and Willow felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. "As have I," she said simply. They finished their coffee in a more comfortable silence, the awkwardness of the previous evening fading as they found their way back to the ease they'd shared in the cabin. When it was time for Preston to leave, Willow walked with him to where his horse waited. The morning sun cast long shadows across the street, and the town was beginning to stir to life around them. "The newspaper comes out on Wednesdays," Willow said as Preston checked his saddle girth. "In case you were wondering when might be a good time to visit." Preston nodded, understanding her meaning. "Wednesdays it is, then." He mounted his horse in one fluid motion, settling into the saddle with the ease of long practice. Willow tilted her head back to look up at him. "Safe journey, please." "Take care of yourself, Willow," he replied. "La Junta's a good town, but it has its share of troubles like anywhere. Don't hesitate to ask Thomas or Marshal Dawson for help if you need it." "I will," she promised, "though I'm quite capable of handling most situations myself." A genuine smile curved Preston's lips. "Of that, I have no doubt." With a touch to the brim of his hat, he turned his horse and rode away, a solitary figure against the backdrop of the snow-covered plains. Willow watched until he disappeared from sight, then turned back to the newspaper office, ready to begin her new life. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity as Willow settled into her role as editor of the La Junta Chronicle. Thomas proved to be an invaluable assistant, introducing her to the town's prominent citizens and helping her learn the rhythms and concerns of the community. She threw herself into her work, visiting farms and ranches to report on agricultural matters, attending town council meetings, and writing editorials that addressed local issues with fairness and insight. Gradually, the initial skepticism that had greeted a female newspaper editor began to give way to grudging respect, at least among most of the townsfolk. Walter Jenkins, who had hoped to take over the paper himself, remained a thorn in her side, questioning her decisions and spreading rumors about her competence. But Willow had faced worse opposition in Boston and refused to be intimidated. Each Wednesday, as the latest edition went to press, Willow found herself watching the door, hoping for a familiar tall figure to appear. And each Wednesday, Preston Blackwell rode into town, ostensibly to pick up supplies or conduct business, but always finding time to stop by the Chronicle office. Their conversations began cautiously, centered mostly around news of the area and the challenges Willow was facing in her new position. But over time, they grew more personal, more comfortable with each other. Preston would bring small gifts, a particularly interesting stone he'd found, a book he thought she might enjoy, once even a jar of wild honey from bees that nested near his cabin. Willow came to look forward to these visits with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. She had come west for independence, not to lose her heart to a solitary cowboy with sad eyes and gentle hands. "You're sweet on him," Thomas observed one day after Preston had left. Having stayed for nearly 2 hours discussing an article, Willow was writing about water rights in the territory. "Don't be ridiculous," Willow protested, though she could feel heat rising in her cheeks. "We're friends, that's all," Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. "If you say so." "But I've known Preston Blackwell for 5 years, and I've never seen him spend 2 hours talking about anything, let alone water rights." Willow couldn't deny the flutter of pleasure his words caused, but she busied herself with arranging type to hide her reaction. Mr. Blackwell is simply concerned about fair reporting on an issue that affects his livelihood, as any rancher would be. MMHMM, Thomas hummed, unconvinced. And I suppose he brings wild honey to all the newspaper editors he knows. Willow had no answer for that, and Thomas tactfully changed the subject to the upcoming town social, an event the Chronicle would be covering in detail. That evening, alone in her rooms above the newspaper office, Willow found herself thinking about Preston more than she cared to admit. There was something about him, his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, the way he listened when she spoke as though her words actually mattered, that drew her like a moth to flame. But Preston had made no explicit overtures beyond his weekly visits, and Willow wasn't entirely sure what she would do if he did. Her independence was precious, hard-won. The newspaper was thriving under her leadership, and she was finally beginning to feel at home in La Junta. Could she reconcile her newfound freedom with the growing feelings she harbored for the taciturn cowboy? And even if she could, would Preston be interested in a woman who valued her career as much as any potential relationship? These questions occupied her thoughts as she prepared for the town social, an event that had grown in importance in her mind, since Thomas had casually mentioned that Preston rarely attended such gatherings, but had been seen purchasing a new shirt at the general store earlier in the week. The social was held in the town hall, a sturdy building that served multiple purposes in La Junta. When Willow arrived, notebook in hand to record the event for the newspaper, the hall was already filled with people, the air buzzing with conversation and laughter. She moved through the crowd, greeting people she recognized, making notes about the decorations and the band that was setting up in one corner. Women in their best dresses clustered in small groups, while men in suits that showed signs of hasty brushing stood awkwardly at the edges of the room. Willow had just finished speaking with the mayor's wife about the refreshment committee when a ripple of interest passed through the crowd near the entrance. She turned to see what had caused it and felt her breath catch in her throat. Preston stood in the doorway, dressed in a dark suit that looked as though it had been freshly pressed for the occasion. His hair was neatly combed, and he'd trimmed his beard. He looked handsome, uncomfortable, and completely out of place among the townspeople who were now regarding him with unconcealed curiosity. His eyes scanned the room until they found Willow, and the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. He made his way toward her, nodding politely but briefly to those who greeted him. "Miss Kincaid," he said formally when he reached her, touching the brim of his hat. "Mr. Blackwell," she replied, equally formal but unable to suppress a smile. "This is an unexpected pleasure. I didn't think you cared for social gatherings." "I don't generally," he admitted, "but I heard the Chronicle would be covering the event and I thought—" He hesitated, then finished. "I thought you might appreciate a perspective from someone who remembers how these things used to be before the railroad came through." It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it, but Willow played along. "How thoughtful. I'd be very interested in your historical insights." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the noise and bustle of the social fading into the background. Then the band struck up a lively tune, and couples began to move onto the dance floor. "Would you care to dance, Miss Kincaid?" Preston asked, the formality of his words at odds with the warmth in his eyes. "I would, Mr. Blackwell," Willow replied, setting aside her notebook. "Though I should warn you, I'm more familiar with Boston's quadrilles than Western reels." Preston's mouth curved in a hint of a smile. "I'm no expert myself, but I think we can manage not to embarrass ourselves too badly." He led her onto the dance floor, placing one hand respectfully at her waist while taking her other hand in his. Willow was acutely aware of his touch, the warmth of his palm against hers, the careful way he held her as they began to move with the music. For a man who claimed no expertise, Preston danced remarkably well, guiding Willow through the steps with confidence. She found herself relaxing into his lead, enjoying the simple pleasure of movement and music and his company. "You dance very well for someone who avoids socials," she observed as they turned with the other couples. "My mother insisted all her sons learn," Preston replied. Said a man who could dance properly would never lack for female company. "A wise woman," Willow smiled. "How many brothers do you have?" "Had two," Preston said. "Both gone now. James fell at Gettysburg. Michael took fever in '71. "I'm sorry," Willow said, regretting the question that had brought such loss to the surface. "It seems unfair that you've had to bear so much grief." Preston's hand tightened slightly on hers. "Life isn't fair as a rule, but it has its moments of grace." His eyes met hers. "This is one of them." The simple statement, delivered in his straightforward manner, affected Willow more deeply than any flowery declaration might have. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks and was glad when the dance required them to separate briefly, giving her a moment to compose herself. When they came together again, Preston said, "I've been reading your editorials. The one about water rights was particularly good. Fair to all sides, but firm on the principle that resources should benefit the many, not just the few." "Thank you," Willow said, pleased by his assessment. "I've tried to understand the issues from multiple perspectives. Your insights were helpful." "Your uncle would be proud of what you're doing with the paper," Preston said. "The Chronicle has never been better." Coming from someone who had known her uncle, this was high praise indeed. "That means a great deal, coming from you." The music ended, and they reluctantly separated, joining in the applause for the band. Before another dance could begin, they were approached by a middle-aged couple Willow recognized as the Hendersons, who owned one of the largest ranches in the area. "Miss Kincaid, lovely to see you," Mrs. Henderson said warmly. "And Preston Blackwell, I declare I haven't seen you at a social in years. What a pleasant surprise." Preston nodded politely. "Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Henderson." "We were just saying how refreshing Miss Kincaid's approach to the newspaper has been," Mr. Henderson said, his gaze shrewd as it moved between Preston and Willow. "Bringing a much-needed new perspective to our little community." "I was just telling her the same thing," Preston agreed. The conversation continued for a few minutes, with the Hendersons making not-so-subtle inquiries about how Preston and Willow had become acquainted. Willow found herself increasingly amused by Preston's growing discomfort under the older couple's matchmaking efforts. When they finally moved on, Preston let out a breath. "I'd forgotten how quickly news travels in a small town, and how interested everyone is in everyone else's business," Willow added with a smile. "Shall we give them more to talk about with another dance, or would you prefer some punch?" "Punch, I think," Preston decided. "Give the gossips time to catch their breath before we provide more fuel." They made their way to the refreshment table, where Preston procured 2 cups of a sweet, fruity concoction that bore little resemblance to the sophisticated punches served at Boston socials, but was refreshing nonetheless. Finding a relatively quiet corner, they sipped their drinks and observed the swirling activity of the social. Willow made occasional notes in her small notebook, but mostly she simply enjoyed Preston's company and the running commentary he provided on various townsfolk and their histories. "The tall fellow in the brown suit, that's Dr. Ellis. Been here since before the war. Delivered half the children in La Junta, including myself." Preston nodded toward a distinguished-looking man with silver hair. "And the woman in the green dress is Widow Martinez. Her husband was one of the original settlers, came up from New Mexico Territory in '52. "You know everyone's story," Willow observed. Preston shrugged. Lived here most of my life except for during the war. You pick things up. Yet you choose to live apart from town, Willow said, voicing a question that had been on her mind for some time. Is it only because of what happened to your family? Preston was quiet for a long moment, and Willow feared she had overstepped. But when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than offended. Partly that, he admitted. But also, I've never been much for crowds or constant company. Even as a boy, I preferred the quiet of the hills to the bustle of town. Sarah understood that. We had a good balance. She brought warmth and life to our home, kept me connected to the community. Without her. He trailed off, then finished. Without her, it was easier to retreat entirely. And now, Willow asked softly, is it still easier? Preston's eyes met hers, steady and searching. Not always, he said. Not lately. The simple admission hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to articulate fully. Before Willow could respond, they were interrupted by Walter Jenkins, whose face was flushed with what appeared to be both excitement and alcohol. Miss Kincaid, he said, his tone overly familiar. I've been looking for you all evening. I believe you promised me a dance. Willow frowned, certain she had made no such promise. I'm afraid you're mistaken, Mr. Jenkins. I've made no such arrangements. Jenkins's expression hardened. Come now, don't be coy. Everyone knows you've been eager for male attention since you arrived. Why else would a woman your age come west alone, if not to find a husband? The crude insinuation brought a flush of anger to Willow's cheeks, but before she could respond, Preston stepped forward, his posture deceptively relaxed but his eyes cold. You're drunk, Jenkins, he said quietly. And you're insulting a lady. I suggest you apologize and move along before you embarrass yourself further. Jenkins scoffed, looking Preston up and down with obvious disdain. Since when do you care about town affairs, Blackwell? Everyone knows you're half wild yourself, living out in the hills like some kind of hermit. He turned back to Willow. You should be careful about the company you keep, Miss Kincaid. A respectable woman wouldn't be seen with a man like this. Preston's jaw tightened, but he made no move toward Jenkins, his control admirable in the face of the provocation. Willow, however, had had enough. Mr. Jenkins, she said, her voice carrying enough to draw the attention of those nearby. I came west to run a newspaper, not to find a husband. And I choose my companions based on their character, not their proximity to town or their ability to conform to arbitrary social expectations. She stepped closer to Preston, deliberately taking his arm. Now, if you'll excuse us, Mr. Blackwell has promised me another dance. Without waiting for Jenkins's response, she led Preston back to the dance floor, where the band was just beginning a slower, more sedate melody. You didn't have to do that, Preston said as they assumed the dance position. Jenkins is a fool, but he has influence with certain people in town. I don't care, Willow replied firmly. What he said was insulting to both of us, and I won't pretend otherwise to appease his ego or curry favor with his friends. A hint of a smile touched Preston's lips. You're a remarkable woman, Willow Kincaid. And you're a remarkable man, Preston Blackwell, she returned, meeting his gaze steadily. Despite what small-minded people like Walter Jenkins might think. They danced in silence for a moment, each processing the exchange and its implications. Then Preston said, I should warn you I'm not an easy man to know. I've been alone a long time, set in my ways. Are you trying to discourage me? Willow asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Being honest, Preston replied. I live simply far from town. My cabin's no place for a woman used to city comforts. I see, Willow said, her tone thoughtful. And have I given you the impression that I'm seeking city comforts, that I came west looking for an easy life? Preston shook his head. No, that's not who you are. Who am I then? Willow asked, genuinely curious about his perception of her. Preston considered the question, his eyes never leaving hers as they moved with the music. "You're someone who faces challenges head-on, who values truth and fairness, who isn't afraid to stand up to men like Jenkins or take on a newspaper in a town where women are expected to keep to traditional roles." His hand tightened slightly on hers. "You're someone who survived a blizzard that would have killed many men, and who didn't complain once about the discomfort or the danger." Willow felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. "That's possibly the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me." The dance ended and they reluctantly separated, but Preston kept hold of her hand. "It's getting late," he said. "May I walk you home?" "Yes," Willow nodded. "I'd like that." They said their goodbyes to the Hendersons and a few others, ignoring the speculative glances and whispered comments that followed them as they left the town hall. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. Their breath formed clouds in the crisp air as they walked the short distance to the Chronicle office. At her door, they paused, suddenly awkward again despite the comfort they'd found in each other's company throughout the evening. "Thank you for the dances," Willow said. "And for defending me from Mr. Jenkins, though I'm perfectly capable of handling him myself." "I know you are," Preston said, "but no one should have to face that kind of disrespect alone." Willow looked up at him, struck again by the contradictions. He embodied a solitary man who nevertheless understood the importance of community, a quiet cowboy with the soul of a philosopher. "Will you still come on Wednesday?" she asked. "For the new edition?" "Yes," Preston nodded. "Though perhaps I might call on you before then. Sunday after church, we could take a ride if the weather's fair." It was a significant step, this formal courtship gesture, and they both knew it. Willow felt a flutter of anticipation in her stomach. "I would like that very much." Preston's smile, rare and genuine, transformed his face. "Until Sunday, then." On impulse, Willow rose on tiptoe and pressed a kiss to his cheek, her lips brushing against his beard. "Good night, Pries." For a moment he seemed frozen, surprised by her boldness. Then his hand came up to touch her cheek gently, his fingers calloused but infinitely tender. "Good night, Willow." She watched from her doorway as he walked away, his tall figure silhouetted against the starlit sky. Only when he had disappeared from view did she close the door, leaning against it with her heart racing like a schoolgirl's after her first dance. Whatever came next would not be simple. They were both independent souls, shaped by loss and determined to forge their own paths. But for the first time since arriving in La Junta, Willow allowed herself to imagine a future that included more than just her newspaper, a future that might also include a quiet cabin on the plains, a taciturn cowboy with gentle hands, and a love that had begun in the most unexpected circumstances. Sunday dawned clear and mild, the harsh winter gradually giving way to the first tentative signs of spring. Willow dressed with particular care for church services, choosing a blue dress that complemented her eyes and arranging her hair in a style that was neat but not severe. The church was a simple white painted building with a modest steeple, the largest structure in La Junta after the town hall. Inside, wooden pews faced a plain altar, and sunshine streamed through clear glass windows. Willow took a seat near the middle, exchanging polite greetings with those around her. She had been attending services regularly since her arrival, finding the ritual familiar even as the congregation and minister were new. It had been a way to meet people and establish herself as part of the community, but today her attention was divided, her gaze repeatedly drifting to the door as she watched for Preston's arrival. He came in just as the service was about to begin, slipping quietly into a pew at the back. He was dressed in his Sunday best, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded church, and Willow felt a flutter of anticipation in her stomach. The service proceeded as usual, with hymns and prayers and a sermon about renewal and growth that seemed particularly apt as the season changed. Willow tried to focus, but her thoughts kept returning to the man sitting at the back of the church and the ride they would take together afterward. When the service ended, the congregation filed out, stopping to chat on the church steps in the pleasant spring sunshine. Willow found herself drawn into a conversation with several ladies of the town's quilting circle, who were eager to tell her about their upcoming exhibition, which they hoped the Chronicle would cover. "Of course," Willow assured them. "I'd be happy to write an article about your work. Perhaps I could come to your next meeting and see some of the quilts in progress." The women were delighted by this suggestion, and Willow was making arrangements to visit when she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she found Preston waiting patiently, hat in hand. "Ladies," he nodded politely to the quilters, who returned his greeting with varying degrees of surprise and interest. "Miss Kincaid, if you're ready for our ride." "Yes, of course," Willow said, making her excuses to the women, who watched with poorly concealed curiosity as Preston offered his arm and led her toward the hitching post where their horses waited. "Sorry to interrupt," he said as they walked, "but I thought you might need rescuing." Willow laughed. "They're just excited about their quilts, and probably more excited about seeing the two of us together." "Small towns," Preston shrugged, but there was a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Nothing stays private for long." He helped her mount Maple, then swung himself onto his own horse. They rode out of town at a leisurely pace, side by side, drawing more than a few interested glances from the townsfolk still gathered outside the church. Once they were beyond the last buildings of La Junta, Preston turned their course eastward, toward a gentle rise in the land that offered a view of the surrounding countryside. "Thought you might like to see a bit more of the area," he explained, "without a blizzard to obscure the view." The day was perfect for riding, sunny but not too warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of earth awakening after winter's sleep. As they rode, Preston pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the land and its history. "That stand of cottonwoods marks the boundary of what used to be Cheyenne hunting grounds," he said, indicating a distant line of trees. "My father traded with them when I was a boy, before the wars drove most of them north." "Were you afraid of them?" Willow asked. Preston considered the question. "No, not afraid. Respectful. They were fighting to keep their way of life just as we were trying to build ours. The tragedy is that those goals seemed mutually exclusive." He shook his head. "There could have been a better way if more men on both sides had been willing to seek it." Willow was struck, as she often was, by the depth of thought behind Preston's quiet exterior. He saw complexities where many others saw only simple conflicts of good versus evil, civilization versus savagery. They reached the rise Preston had aimed for and dismounted, allowing the horses to graze on the new grass while they sat on a sun-warmed boulder. The view was spectacular rolling plains stretching toward distant mountains, the tiny cluster of buildings that was La Junta, and the silver ribbon of a stream winding through the landscape. "It's beautiful," Willow said softly. "I never imagined the plains could be so vast and yet so detailed all at once." "It changes with the seasons," Preston replied. "In summer, these grasslands will be alive with wildflowers. By autumn, the grass turns gold, rippling like the sea when the wind blows across it." "You love this land," Willow observed. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Preston nodded. "It's not always kind, as you learned in that blizzard, but it's honest in its harshness. You know where you stand with it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts as they gazed out over the landscape. Willow found herself studying Preston's profile, the strong line of his jaw, now smooth-shaven, the slight furrow between his brows that never quite disappeared, the way the sun brought out auburn highlights in his dark hair. As though sensing her scrutiny, he turned to meet her gaze. "What is it?" Willow smiled, not embarrassed at being caught. "I was just thinking how fortunate I am that you found me in that snowstorm, not just because you saved my life, but because it led to this." She gestured vaguely between them. Preston's expression softened. "I've been thinking the same thing." He hesitated, then added, "I wasn't looking for anything when I rode out that day, just checking my trap lines, but finding you." He trailed off, searching for words. "It woke something in me that I thought was gone for good." The admission, so simply stated but so profound, touched Willow deeply. She reached out, placing her hand over his where it rested on the rock between them. "I'm glad," she said softly, "for both our sakes." Preston turned his hand over, his fingers intertwining with hers. The touch was warm and solid, anchoring her to this moment, this place, this man. "I'm not good with words," he said after a moment. "Not like you. But I want you to know that these past weeks, seeing you on Wednesdays, thinking about you the rest of the time, it's been the happiest I've been in years." "You don't need flowery words, please," Willow assured him. "You speak honestly, and that means more to me than any poet's verses." His eyes searched hers, as if seeking confirmation of something vital. Whatever he found there seemed to reassure him, because he nodded once, decision made. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned forward. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question more than a declaration. Willow's eyes fluttered closed as she leaned into it, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they parted, Preston's eyes were filled with a warmth that made Willow's breath catch. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch reverent. "I never expected to feel this way again," he said quietly. "Neither did I," Willow admitted. "I came west for independence, for a fresh start. Romance wasn't part of my plan." "Plans change," Preston said, echoing what he'd told her during the blizzard. "Sometimes for the better." They spent the afternoon exploring the area, riding side by side and talking more freely than ever before. Preston showed her his favorite places, a hidden spring, a rock formation shaped like a sleeping giant, a meadow where he promised wildflowers would bloom in profusion come May. As the sun began to dip toward the western horizon, they reluctantly turned back toward La Junta. The ride home was quieter, both of them contemplating the shift in their relationship and what it might mean for their futures. At the door of the Chronicle office, Preston helped Willow dismount, his hands lingering at her waist just a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for today," he said. "It's been special." "Yes, it has," Willow agreed, looking up at him with a smile. "When will I see you again?" "Wednesday as usual." "Wednesday," Preston nodded. "And perhaps—" He hesitated, then seemed to make up his mind. "Perhaps you might consider visiting my cabin this coming weekend. I could show you more of the area, and you could see where I live, if you're interested." The invitation was significant, a deliberate opening of his private world to her. Willow didn't hesitate. "I'd like that very much." Relief and pleasure mingled in Preston's expression. "I'll come for you Saturday morning if that suits." "It's perfect," Willow assured him. This time, it was Preston who leaned down to kiss her, his lips meeting hers in a goodbye that carried the promise of hello. Willow savored the moment, memorizing the feel of him, the scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to his skin. "Good night, Willow," he murmured when they finally parted. "Good night, please," she replied, watching as he mounted his horse and rode away, turning once to lift his hand in farewell before disappearing around a corner. Willow entered her rooms above the newspaper office with a lightness in her step that had been absent before. Her future, which had seemed so clearly defined when she arrived in La Junta, now held new possibilities that included a quiet cowboy with sad eyes and gentle hands, who had built a fire and kept her warm in more ways than one. The week passed in a flurry of activity at the Chronicle. Willow attended the quilters' meeting as promised, wrote an article about the upcoming county fair, and engaged in a spirited but civil debate with Walter Jenkins about water rights at the town council meeting. Through it all, her anticipation for Wednesday and for Saturday hummed like a constant melody beneath the surface of her thoughts. When Wednesday arrived, Willow found herself checking the clock more often than usual, her attention divided between the newspaper's final layout and the door through which Preston would eventually appear. Thomas noticed, of course, but limited his commentary to knowing smiles and the occasional raised eyebrow. Preston arrived mid-afternoon, just as the latest edition was rolling off the press. He entered quietly, as was his way, but his eyes immediately sought Willow's across the busy office. Something in his gaze, a warmth, an openness that hadn't been there before, sent a flutter through her stomach. "Right on time, Mr. Blackwell," Thomas called cheerfully. "First copies are just coming off the press." Preston nodded in greeting but made his way directly to Willow, who was checking the final pages for errors. "Busy day?" he asked, his deep voice pitched low for her ears alone. "Always on press day," Willow replied with a smile, "but never too busy for you." The simple statement brought a hint of color to Preston's cheeks, and Willow was charmed by this evidence that she affected him as strongly as he affected her. Their courtship, if that's what this was becoming, was proceeding at its own pace, neither rushed nor delayed, but unfolding naturally like the seasons themselves. "I've brought something for you," Preston said, reaching into his coat pocket. He withdrew a small package wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with string. "It's nothing elaborate, but I thought you might like it." Willow accepted the package, curious. "May I open it now?" Preston nodded, watching her face as she untied the string and carefully unwrapped the paper. Inside lay a small wooden box, beautifully crafted from polished pine with a simple pattern of leaves carved into the lid. "Did you make this?" Willow asked, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "Yes," Preston admitted. "Thought you might need somewhere to keep special things." "Letters, mementos." Willow opened the box, finding the interior lined with soft cloth. It was a thoughtful, personal gift, practical yet beautiful, much like the man who had made it. "It's perfect," she said, looking up at him with genuine appreciation. "Thank you." Preston seemed pleased by her reaction, his usual reserve softening. "You're welcome. I enjoy working with my hands, creating something lasting." "You have a gift," Willow told him sincerely. "This is beautiful craftsmanship." They were interrupted by Thomas, who approached with the first complete copy of the day's edition. "Hot off the press, Miss Kincaid, and I think you'll be especially interested in page 3, Mr. Blackwell." Willow accepted the newspaper, knowing exactly what Thomas was referring to. She had written a detailed article about sustainable hunting practices, incorporating many of the observations Preston had shared with her over their conversations. It was factual and educational, but it also painted a portrait of a way of life that was becoming increasingly rare as the West became more settled. Preston read the article carefully, his expression thoughtful. When he finished, he looked up at Willow with newfound respect. "This is exceptional," he said. "You captured the essence of it without romanticizing or condemning. That's rare." "I had an excellent source," Willow replied with a smile, "though I hope you don't mind being quoted." "Not at all," Preston assured her. It's important information for newcomers especially. Might save some lives. Might save some game from needless waste. They spent the next hour discussing the rest of the newspaper's contents, Preston offering insights and occasionally challenging Willow's perspectives in a way that she found stimulating rather than confrontational. It was this his willingness to engage with her intellectually, to treat her as an equal that Willow found most attractive about him. As evening approached, Preston reluctantly prepared to leave. "I should head back before dark," he said, "but I'll see you Saturday morning." "I'll be ready," Willow promised. "What should I bring for the journey?" "Just yourself," Preston replied, "and perhaps a change of clothes. The weather can be unpredictable this time of year." They said their goodbyes with the awareness of Thomas's presence keeping them more formal than they might have been otherwise. But Preston's hand lingered on hers as he took his leave, and his eyes held a promise that made Willow's heart quicken. After he had gone, Thomas busied himself cleaning the press, whistling cheerfully. "Never thought I'd see the day," he remarked casually. "Preston Blackwell bringing gifts and reading newspapers like a regular town fellow." "He's always read the newspaper," Willow pointed out, trying to sound nonchalant. "True enough," Thomas conceded, "but he never lingered to discuss every article with the editor before." He paused in his cleaning to look at her directly. "He's a good man, Miss Kincaid." Different, private, set in his ways but good to the core. Edward thought highly of him. "As do I," Willow said simply. Thomas nodded, satisfied. "Good, that's good." He returned to his cleaning, the matter settled as far as he was concerned. Willow spent the rest of the week preparing for her visit to Preston's cabin. She was both excited and nervous, eager to see his home, to understand more fully the life he had built for himself, but also aware that this represented a significant step in their developing relationship. By Saturday morning, she was ready, a small carpet bag packed with essentials, and her anticipation barely contained. Preston arrived precisely when he had promised, riding up to the Chronicle office just as the town was beginning to stir to life. "Good morning," he greeted her, dismounting to help with her bag. "Sleep well?" "Not particularly," Willow admitted with a smile. "I was too excited about today." Preston's eyes warmed at her candor. "I'm glad you're coming. It's about a 2-hour ride if we take it easy." He secured her bag behind his saddle, then helped her mount Maple. They set out under a clear spring sky, the air crisp but promising warmth later in the day. As they rode side by side, leaving the town behind, Willow felt a sense of freedom and possibility that matched the wide open landscape around them. Preston was more talkative than usual, pointing out features of the terrain, sharing stories of the area's history, identifying birds and plants that Willow, with her Eastern upbringing, couldn't name. His knowledge of the land was extensive and intimate, the product of a lifetime spent observing and respecting nature's rhythms. As they rode, the landscape gradually changed, becoming more varied, with gentle hills and small copses of trees breaking up the expanse of prairie. Eventually they crested a rise and Preston reined his horse to a stop. "There it is," he said, gesturing ahead. "Home." Willow followed his gaze to where a small cabin nestled against a hillside, sheltered by a stand of pines. A curl of smoke rose from the chimney, and nearby stood a barn and corral. A stream glinted in the sunlight, winding past the homestead before disappearing into a grove of cottonwoods. It was beautiful in its simplicity, perfectly positioned to take advantage of natural protection from the elements while affording a clear view of the surrounding countryside. Willow could see why Preston had chosen this spot. It offered both shelter and solitude, security and independence. "It's wonderful," she said sincerely. "So peaceful." Preston looked pleased by her reaction. "It suits me. Not grand, but solid. Built it myself, most of it. They rode down to the cabin where Preston helped Willow dismount before seeing to the horses. Willow stood for a moment, taking in the details of his homestead. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from a distance, well constructed of squared logs with a stone foundation. A covered porch wrapped around two sides, furnished with a simple bench and what appeared to be a chair in progress. The wood partially shaped but not yet completed. Flower beds, still dormant from winter but clearly tended, lined the path to the door. A stack of firewood was neatly arranged against one wall, and tools hung in precise order beneath the porch overhang. Everything spoke of care and order, a place where each item had its purpose and place. Preston returned from settling the horses in the corral. "Come inside," he invited, picking up her carpet bag. "I've had a fire going since morning, so it should be warm." The interior of the cabin was larger than Willow had expected, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, a bedroom visible through an open door, and what appeared to be a small study or workshop in another adjoining space. The furnishings were simple but well crafted, many bearing the distinctive style of Preston's woodworking. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a cheerful fire crackling within it. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes ranging from practical guides to classical literature. The kitchen area was neat and functional, with a cast iron stove, a workbench, and open shelving holding dishes and cooking implements. "It's lovely," Willow said, turning to take it all in. "So much more spacious than it looks from outside." "Built it with the idea that a family might live here someday," Preston explained, setting her bag down. He didn't need to finish the thought. Before his wife and child died, leaving him alone, Willow moved to the bookshelf, examining the titles. "You have an impressive library." "Books are good company on long winter evenings," Preston replied. "Sarah loved to read. Many of those were hers." He joined Willow at the shelf, pulling out a volume of poetry. This was her favorite, Wordsworth. The simple fact that he had kept his wife's books, that he spoke of her naturally as part of his home's history, told Willow much about the kind of man Preston was. There was no jealousy in her heart at the mention of Sarah, only a deep respect for the love he had shared with his first wife and the honorable way he honored her memory. "Would you like coffee?" Preston offered. "Or I could show you around the property first if you prefer." "The tour first, I think," Willow decided. While the day is still young, Preston nodded, leading her back outside. He showed her the barn, where he kept tools and supplies, the vegetable garden he had already begun preparing for spring planting, and the smokehouse where he preserved meat from his hunting. Everything was meticulously maintained, the work of a man who took pride in self-sufficiency. "And this," he said, leading her to a small fenced area behind the cabin, "is Sarah's garden." Within the fence bloomed early spring flowers, crocuses, snowdrops, and the first green shoots of what would become daffodils and tulips. A simple wooden bench sat among them, positioned to catch the morning sun. "She loved flowers," Preston explained, his voice softening with memory. "Said every home needed something that existed purely for beauty, not just function. I've kept it up as best I can." Willow was touched by this tangible evidence of his devotion. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "She would be pleased, I think." Preston nodded, his expression distant for a moment before returning to the present. "There's one more place I'd like to show you," he said. "It's a short ride from here." They saddled the horses again and rode for perhaps 15 minutes, following the stream until it widened into a small, clear pool at the base of a rocky outcropping. Trees surrounded the area, creating a natural sanctuary that felt removed from the world. "My thinking place," Preston said as they dismounted. "When decisions need making or troubles need sorting, I come here." "I can see why," Willow replied, taking in the peaceful setting. "It feels sacred somehow." They sat on sun-warmed rocks beside the pool, listening to the gentle sound of water moving over stone. Birds called in the trees around them, and a light breeze carried the scent of pine and new growth. "I wanted you to see this," Preston said after a comfortable silence. "To understand the life I've built here. It's not what most women would want, isolated, rough in many ways, far from the conveniences of town." "Are you trying to warn me away again?" Willow asked gently. "Because if so, you're not doing a very good job of it. Everything you've shown me today only makes me appreciate you and this place more." Preston looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "I need to be honest about what a life here would mean, Willow. Winters are harsh. The work never ends. Town is far away, especially in bad weather." "I understand that," Willow assured him, "but you're forgetting something important." "What's that?" "I've already survived the worst winter could throw at me," she reminded him with a smile. "Thanks to you." A smile tugged at the corners of Preston's mouth. "That you did." His expression grew serious again. "What about the newspaper? It's your dream, your independence." "The Chronicle is important to me," Willow acknowledged, "and I have no intention of abandoning it, but La Junta is only a few hours' ride away." Many editors manage their papers while living outside town. She hesitated, then added, "That is, if a more permanent arrangement were ever to be considered." It was the closest either of them had come to directly addressing the future, and Willow felt her heart beating faster as she waited for Preston's response. He reached for her hand, his larger one enveloping hers with gentle strength. "I've been considering exactly that," he admitted. "Since the town's social, perhaps even before, but I didn't want to rush you or to assume." "And I've been thinking about it too," Willow confessed, "wondering if what we feel for each other could grow into something lasting." Preston's eyes never left hers. "I believe it could, Willow. I know it's been a short time, but I've never felt more certain of anything." The simple declaration, delivered with his characteristic straightforwardness, filled Willow with a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. "Neither have I," she said softly. Preston leaned forward then, closing the distance between them. This kiss was different from their previous ones, deeper, more certain, a promise rather than a question. Willow's arms went around his neck as she returned the kiss with equal fervor, her heart racing with the rightness of it. When they finally parted, Preston kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I didn't expect to love again, but here we are." "Here we are," Willow echoed, her voice thick with emotion. "And I love you too, Preston Blackwell, with all my heart." They remained by the pool for some time, talking of the future, of possibilities, of the life they might build together. Nothing was decided definitively. They were both too practical for hasty decisions, but a path forward was beginning to take shape. As the sun began to dip toward the western horizon, they reluctantly returned to the cabin. Preston prepared a simple but satisfying supper, and they ate at the table by the fire, the conversation flowing easily between them. After the meal, they sat side by side on the porch, watching as twilight settled over the land and the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. "It's so quiet," Willow observed. "In town, there's always some sound, people talking, horses on the street, the press running. But here—" "It takes some getting used to," Preston admitted. "The silence. But after a while you start to hear things you missed before: the wind in the pines, the calls of night birds, the creatures going about their business." Willow leaned against his shoulder, feeling utterly content. "I could get used to it, I think." Preston's arm came around her, holding her close against the evening chill. "I hope you'll have that chance," he said quietly. They stayed on the porch until the night grew too cool for comfort, then moved inside where Preston built up the fire. The cabin was transformed in the firelight, the simple furnishings taking on a golden glow that made the space feel both intimate and welcoming. Preston showed Willow to the small guest room he had prepared for her, a simple space with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair. "It's not much," he apologized. "Hardly ever have visitors." "It's perfect," Willow assured him, touched by his concern for her comfort and his respect for propriety. They might love each other, but certain conventions would be observed until their relationship was formalized. Before retiring, they sat by the fire a while longer, planning the next day's activities, a longer ride to show Willow more of the surrounding area, perhaps fishing in the stream if the weather remained fair. It was domestic and ordinary and utterly wonderful in its simplicity. When they finally said goodnight, Preston's kiss was tender, reverent, filled with promise but restrained by respect. "Sleep well," he murmured. "I'll be here when you wake." In her small room, Willow prepared for bed, her mind filled with the events of the day and the possibilities that had opened before her. She had come west seeking independence and a fresh start. She had found those things, yes, but also something she hadn't been looking for, a love as vast and unexpected as the western landscape itself. As she drifted toward sleep, Willow found herself thinking of that desperate day in the blizzard, when all hope had seemed lost. How strange and wonderful that her darkest moment had led, ultimately, to this brightness. Preston had built a fire and kept her warm on that terrible day, saving her life. But in doing so, he had also kindled something else, a flame of connection and possibility that now promised to warm them both for all the days to come. 6 months later, as autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and amber, Willow stood on the porch of what was now their cabin, watching as Preston rode in from checking the small herd of cattle they had begun to build. The setting sun cast his figure in silhouette, a sight that still made her heart quicken, even after 3 months of marriage. So much had changed since that spring day when they had confessed their love by the quiet pool. Preston had formally courted her through the summer, riding to town every Wednesday for the newspaper and every Sunday to accompany her to church. Their courtship had been the talk of La Junta, of course, but Willow found she didn't mind the gossip when it was founded on something as genuine as their growing love. They had married in August, a simple ceremony in the La Junta church with Thomas and his wife as witnesses. Willow had worn a new dress of pale blue silk, ordered specially from Denver, and Preston had looked so handsome in his suit that she could scarcely take her eyes off him throughout the service. The question of where they would live had been resolved with a practical compromise that suited them both. Willow maintained her rooms above the Chronicle office for the nights she needed to stay in town to prepare the newspaper for press. The rest of the time, she lived with Preston at the cabin, making the ride to town as needed, sometimes with Preston, sometimes alone. Thomas had taken on more responsibility at the newspaper, proving himself more than capable of handling the day-to-day operations when Willow was absent. And to everyone's surprise, including his own, Walter Jenkins had turned out to be an excellent reporter once he accepted that Willow was there to stay. His knowledge of local affairs and his connections throughout the county made him a valuable asset to the Chronicle, despite his initial hostility. Preston had expanded the cabin, adding a larger kitchen and a room that served as Willow's office, where she could write and edit when not at the newspaper office. He had also built a more direct trail to town, cutting the riding time by nearly 30 minutes. It was a good compromise, allowing them both to maintain their independence while building a life together. Now, As Preston approached the cabin, Willow's hand drifted to her still flat stomach, where their first child had just begun to make its presence known. She hadn't told Preston yet, wanting to be certain before sharing the news. But after a visit to Dr. Ellis earlier that week, there was no doubt. By spring, their family would grow by one. "Beautiful evening," Preston observed as he joined her on the porch, pressing a kiss to her temple in greeting. "Cattle are looking good. That new bull was worth every penny." "I'm glad," Willow replied, leaning into his embrace. "I have supper almost ready." And news from town: Thomas says circulation is up another 10% since we added the monthly supplement on ranching practices. Preston nodded with approval. "Good. People need practical information more than they need gossip." He studied her face in the fading light. "You look tired." "Been pushing yourself too hard again," Willow smiled, touched by his concern. "Not exactly, but I do have something to tell you, something important." Preston's expression grew serious. "Everything all right?" "More than all right," Willow assured him, taking his hand and placing it gently over her stomach. "We're going to have a baby, please. Next spring." For a moment, Preston stood perfectly still, his hand warm against her through the fabric of her dress. Then his eyes widened, a mixture of joy and disbelief spreading across his features. "A baby, you're certain?" Willow nodded, her own eyes filling with happy tears. "Dr. Ellis confirmed it. He says I'm in excellent health and everything looks promising." A sound that was half laugh, half sob escaped Preston as he pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of the most precious glass. "A child," he whispered against her hair. "Our child." The wonder in his voice made Willow's heart swell with love. She knew what this meant to him, a second chance at the fatherhood that had been cruelly snatched away 5 years ago. A new beginning. "Are you happy?" she asked softly, though she could feel the answer in the way he held her. Preston drew back just enough to look into her eyes, his own shining with emotion. "Happy doesn't begin to describe it, Willow. You've brought so much joy back into my life, first with your love and now with this miracle." His hand returned to her stomach, gentle and protective. "I never thought I'd have this chance again." "Life has a way of surprising us," Willow said, echoing words he had once spoken to her. "Sometimes for the better." Preston's smile was radiant, transforming his usually serious face. "Indeed it does." He led her to the bench on the porch, sitting beside her with their hands still joined. "When did you find out?" "Just yesterday," Willow replied. "I've suspected for a couple of weeks but wanted to be sure before I told you. And you're feeling well, no sickness or discomfort?" Willow squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Some queasiness in the mornings, but nothing severe. Dr. Ellis says I'm in perfect health." Preston nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Good, that's good." His brow furrowed slightly. "What about the newspaper? Will you be able to continue working?" "For now, certainly," Willow said. "And after the baby comes well, we'll figure it out together. Thomas can take on more responsibility if needed, and the cabin has plenty of room for a nursery." She looked at him curiously. "Unless you'd prefer I focus solely on being a mother." "No," Preston said immediately. "The newspaper is part of who you are, Willow. I would never ask you to give that up. We'll find a balance that works for our family." His answer confirmed what Willow already knew, that she had married a man who truly valued her as an equal partner, who respected her work and her ambitions as much as his own. It was a rare quality, especially in this time and place, and she treasured it. "I love you, Preston Blackwell," she said softly. "More each day." "And I love you, Willow Blackwell," he replied, his voice husky with emotion. "You and our child." They sat together on the porch as twilight deepened into night, planning and dreaming, their voices mingling with the sounds of the prairie evening, the soft hooting of an owl, the rustle of wind through the pines, the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. Above them, stars filled the vast Colorado sky, countless points of light in the velvet darkness. It was a sky that had witnessed their first meeting in the midst of a deadly blizzard, had watched over their growing love, and would now see the expansion of their family. A sky as boundless as the future stretching before them. Preston's arm tightened around Willow's shoulders, drawing her close against the evening chill. "Let's go inside," he said. "I'll build up the fire." Willow smiled at the simple words that now carried so much meaning for them both. On that terrible winter day when she had been lost and freezing, when hope had seemed as distant as warmth, Preston had found her. He had built a fire and kept her warm, saving her life with his quiet competence and steadfast care. Neither of them could have imagined then that his act of kindness would lead to love and marriage, to a home filled with purpose and joy, to the promise of new life growing within her. But as they entered their cabin together, Willow knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Preston built up the fire as promised, the flames leaping to cast a golden glow throughout the room. And as they had done every night since their wedding, they prepared for the evening together, a simple meal shared at the table, conversation about their day, plans for tomorrow, dreams for the future. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, gentle harbingers of the winter to come. But inside, all was warmth and light and love, a fire built by caring hands, a home created through shared purpose, and a future as bright as the flames that danced upon the hearth.